there have to be things like unions where people can collectively bargain for the value of their data. This is essential because if it's each person against each other person, then the price will collapse. On the internet, there's nobody who's on your side, and there needs to be, so they can serve that function. They can become the first advocates.
If nothing changes, then things just continue to get commoditized and we get packetized and commoditized. The idea of data dignity to me is profound because I think it's fundamental to what the future can look like. It is my pleasure to welcome to Yang Speaks the visionary, technologist, futurist, philosopher, musician, Jaron Lanier. Jaron, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So Jaron, you should know I quote you on the trail, or I quoted you when I was running for president all the time. Some of your ideas I think are so important for not just the future, but what we're facing right now. So the idea I quoted most often was you've written and spoken on the fact that negative ideas and sentiment spread more powerfully and viscerally online through social media than positive sentiments. And that has very, very profound implications.
Yeah, unfortunately, at least my understanding of it is that we're dealing with some very old and kind of nasty evolutionary legacies, because in the human cognitive system, we have these stupid rapid fire systems that we usually call the fight or flight responses, which are coping with danger, where we have like if we were talking about computers, we talk about them as, inescapable low-level subroutines in the operating system. They're not just an app, they're baked in really deep. And so we have to decide whether to run or fight. And because those are so deep, since the beginning of civilization, people have known that if you want to get others' attention and if you want to sort of manipulate them, activating this system is one way to do it. But what has never happened before is we've never had an interactive system that's constantly measuring people and optimizing itself to activate these old systems in the human being. So what happens is when the whole society is kind of constantly being prodded by the algorithms to excite their fight or flight responses, and it's not like anybody at Google or Facebook sat there and said they wanted to do this. Well, maybe at Facebook, but certainly not at Google. It's just that the algorithm naturally optimized itself into finding this thing because it's there waiting to be found by any adaptive algorithm. So then what happens is you get this diffuse version of it, shifting the society's cognition. And the diffuse version I like to call just irritability and paranoia. And so you get this wafting cloud of irritability and paranoia, which then colors everything and makes people less sane and less able to deal with reality than they used to be.
Well, one of the things you say drives this, and I think this is also both correct and profound, is the business models of these companies, where you have companies that are essentially profiting off of clicks and engagement for advertising revenue. And so it's not just that they're tapping into these parts of our brains that have been hardwired, but then they get rewarded for it.
Yeah. I was around when that happened, and it's really a drag. It's sort of a tragedy how it all unfolded. Way back in the beginning, there were a few ideas that a lot of people believed in very intensely. Everybody wanted to have perfect socialism online where there wouldn't be money and everything would be free. Everybody wanted to worship tech entrepreneurs, like Steve Jobs as an example. And just to resolve those two things was really hard. And the only solution anyone ever found was the advertising model. And if it was just old-fashioned advertising like on TV, it would be no worse than that was. And overall, I think that's done more good than harm, although some people disagree with me. But it wasn't old-fashioned advertising. It turned into this constant measurement and feedback system, this behavior modification system. And that's where we ran into trouble.
Yeah, I think you coined an acronym around this, the bummer acronym, which I thought was both clever and apt.
Yeah. Let's see if I can remember it. Behavior of users modified and made into an empire for rent.
Yeah, I thought that was indeed a bummer. That really summed it up, particularly because the empire that's being rented or built is being built on our data, like our habits, our preferences, what we like, what we react to, what we clicked on. And you're passionate about the fact that our data should be ours as one of the big reforms.
Yeah. So this is something I've been thinking about for many years, and I'm more convinced than ever. I don't think it's the only solution we need. I don't think it's like some kind of magic key to fixing the future, but I do think it's one part of the mix that we definitely need. If you think back on the history of how people have contributed to civilization, one of the really interesting high points for me was the introduction of the idea of quality by Deming. Or Six Sigma, sometimes it's called, where what you do is you have people who are working on something become aware of how what they're doing is contributing to quality for the society so that they can take pride on it instead of being treated like robots. And this is famously how Japan moved from being a bad manufacturing company to the best manufacturing company by making people working on an auto line, for instance, aware of how what they did affected the outcome of the automobile and listening to them, treating them as human beings. But in Silicon Valley, we haven't learned that lesson. What we say is when we get data from people, we're going to treat it as exhaust. That's always the word. Oh, it's just their exhaust, as if people couldn't contribute. And then we get all this data in that people didn't know they were contributing, and then we're supposed to make it useful in algorithms. Wouldn't it make more sense? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it just be smarter for people to understand how their data could be used to be motivated to earn some money, to make it better, to become creative participants, to take on some of the power, the decision-making power of what the ultimate algorithm should do? I mean, wouldn't it just make everything better for this to be more distributed? Like this idea of treating people as mindless exhaust generation.
As like rats in the maze, being like, yeah, don't worry about it.
Or it's like the people acting as batteries in the Matrix movies. Like, it's just stupid. Like, if the Matrix movies were real, the whole thing would collapse because they wouldn't have good enough data to run their AI agents. You know, like people should participate and make good data. Like, what isn't that a more sensible? It's just more dignified, and it'll make everything better.
The idea of data dignity to me is profound because I think it's fundamental to what the future can look like. If nothing changes, then things just continue to get commoditized, and we get packetized and commoditized. So I agree with you that there's something fundamental about data dignity, like treating us like not just I guess vehicles like emitting extra data exhaust.
Yeah.
But as agents, as participants, as owners, in my mind, as renters of our data, if we decide to share for our convenience.
Yeah, one of the key ideas of data dignity is that you can't just sell your data. You can only license it. You have moral rights to it, kind of like an artist in France or something like that. This is extremely important because you don't want to have some kind of data indentured servitude. What you want to have is, and then here's another idea that might not sound very Silicon Valley, but I think is really important. There have to be things like unions where people can collectively bargain for the value of their data. This is essential because if it's each person against each other person, then the price will collapse. But that's true of absolutely everything. Like when we think about labor, we talk about unions, but the supposedly elite scientists like me who are involved in Silicon Valley companies, we get together and we make corporations, we make startups. We also band together to limit the degree to which we're constantly fighting each other as individuals. It's an absolutely necessary step to building up a society. So I don't think ordinary people who make data won't join exactly something like a classical union. We need something new, but it'll have some of the qualities of a union.
Well, there is a massive collective action problem, obviously, because if you're an individual user, You're just clicking I agree, I consent, and hoping for the best.
Yeah. I mean, oh gosh, a long time ago, I co-founded as a commission in the EU. That was one of the things that eventually turned into the GDPR, their big privacy framework. And one time I was in Geneva and I had like 2,000 data lawyers from around the EU. And I said, have any of you ever read one of these agreements that you click on that wasn't the one you wrote, but that somebody else wrote? And not a single hand went up. Like even the lawyers don't know what they say. And so in theory, the GDPR standardized them a bit, but I don't really think it's had much of an effect because the truth is code speaks louder than law, you know?
Yeah, completely. And I think your idea of like a digital union for data rights, I think is necessary. It's vital because as an individual, you're outgunned. Government is decades behind this curve. They don't even understand many of these issues. Though I'm happy to say that now certain states like California are at least putting laws on the books to start trying to empower individuals to a higher degree.
Yeah, you know, the California data dividend law might very well be remembered as a key step along the path to making a workable future. We'll see. There's still a lot that's unknown about how it'll sort out, but it's a really interesting process. And for once, there are some people in the loop who understand a few of these things. And I feel like the different people who have different opinions are actually talking to each other. So it's kind of a bright spot.
I love the fact that you've become a voice for reform of the internet, reform of what these tech companies are doing with our data, because to me, it's so central. And you're one of the few people who can speak authoritatively about it because you're one of the godfathers of the modern internet.
Well, God help us. Hey, can I say a little bit more about these union-like things?
Please, would love it.
Sometimes we call them MIDs for mediators of individual data. That's been a term used in the academic literature. In the California law, they're called data trusts. I don't know how similar the California law will be to the academic ideal. We'll see. But the idea of a MID, it's not just a union that collectively bargains so that the prices don't fall to zero. It does a few other things. It provides for the very first time a fiducial service. So a fiducial is somebody who has more power over a part of your life than you do and swears an oath to only serve your interests and not anyone else's. And a good example would be a doctor or a lawyer or certain financial advisors. But there's nothing like that on the internet. On the internet, there's nobody who's on your side. And there needs to be, so they can serve that function. They can become the first advocates. They can become the first complexity managers so that you can say to them, okay, I don't know all these contracts. I don't know all this stuff. You figure it out.
I've got a name for these collectives, Data Guild. What do you think? I just made it up.
No, Guild, I think that's actually an interesting one because guilds are one of the predecessors of the medieval guilds were societal institutions that were secular and really important to holding everything together. And they definitely were precursors for institutions, not just unions, but also benevolent organizations and other societal structures that were really important in the emergence of decent modern democracies.
One of the things you hit on that's really powerful is that our data becomes much more valuable if we willingly participate, because right now you can only do certain things anonymously, and that if I'm actually a partner in this, then the value shoots up, and I may be completely happy with that if I'm actually sharing in that value, as opposed to right now it all getting passed around without my knowledge. Jaron, you've identified so many of like the massive problems that are killing us, really. So we started by you talking about how the internet is making us essentially more irritable and paranoid. And then
Yeah.
we which you can't really argue with. I mean that's happening, and then we agree that the business models are helping fuel that dynamic because they thrive on this war for attention. How do we need to reform the business models so that that some of these companies are also fueled by decency and reducing the negative effects on our democracy, culture, society, discourse, you name it, because it's affecting everything.
Well, if I had my way, the behavior modification business model would be outlawed, and you can draw a bright line about it. To be specific about what that means, the use of an algorithm to measure human behavior in order to customize content for the benefit of a third party who's paying, that chain of events. You can define because you can see where the information and the money move in the system, and that should be outlawed. That should be considered a corrupt and just bad model. And then, as an alternative to it, there are a number of excellent ones, and the most obvious one is just charging people for whatever you have and then also paying them for what they give and really turning it into part of capitalism instead of this weird pseudo stealth socialism. So Google and Twitter and Facebook would ask you to pay subscription, and people don't mind that. They pay crazy amounts. I mean, they do it for Netflix and things like Xbox and all kinds of stuff. I mean, the subscription model works. There have to be allowances for those who can't afford it, but that can work too. I mean, I really don't.
Well, you know
think
what might help with this? It
problem.
sounds like universal basic income might be a helpful precursor to this.
Well, we should talk about that. So,
but please, finish out the thought because I interrupted you. There's
okay,
like the idea,
no,
yeah.
all right. Well, so the thing is, I don't believe that markets always work. I think there are market failures, and I think markets are technology like any other, and they have to be tweaked and used well. And there's no such thing as a perfect technology, but when they work, they work. And so it's very strange that Silicon Valley, as it's grown up, has been kind of anti-market, and that everyone's expected to do this sort of pseudo-socialist barter thing, and it's silly. I mean, we have this terrible fear that people wouldn't pay for Google or Facebook, but I think they would. I mean, it might take a while. It might take a generation for people to get used to it. But
essentially, what you're saying and I'm saying is that we're already paying. We're just like paying under the rug. You know what I mean?
Oh, we're paying much too high a price. We're paying by loss of dignity and seeing our society darkened by weird paranoia and irritability. So the price is very high, but it's not direct. You don't see the immediate connection.
Yes, I love it. This is like this incredibly expensive negative externality cloaked in the guise of it being cost free.
Yeah, it's really funny because it's almost like a dorm room level idea of like, oh yeah, we'll make everything free. It's silly, and yet it still has hold of some of these giant companies. But I want to give you a thought experiment, and this gets us closer to the question about UBI. What if in the future robots and AI programs could do everything? So there was no task that a human needed to do anymore. All right. So then, of course, the classic question is, does that mean that the humans starve, or does that mean that the humans thrive? Right. And so obviously we'll never get there 100%, but if we get closer to it, even by a small degree, we don't want it to increase human suffering. We want it to increase human thriving. Right. And so, but at that extreme, at that asymptotic extreme, where is the value coming from in the society? And obviously, the only way that robots and AIs can function is if they have data and if they're adapting towards goals. And those have to come from people by definition, if the society is meant for people at all. And so therefore, the data from people, even if it's only in the form of expressing taste or desires, is the fuel that runs that future and has to be considered the most valuable resource. And that's a strange way of thinking. We're not used to thinking of thought itself or desire as a form of labor. And I don't want us to think that way in all cases, because that could become dismal in its own way of making people into sort of desiring machines of sort of some kind of absolute consumerist hell or something. But if we want to have a future for employment, and we want employment to be real and based on things that people really offer, allowing that data is a form of labor gives us a way to create legitimate employment for a large part of the society, maybe not all of it, but I think this is what we call data dignity. I think it's a way to imagine that more robots mean more jobs instead of less jobs, and I think it's logically consistent. And I think the numbers work out. And I think it's not an idea opposed to UBI, but it might be that the future will be one in which there's both UBI and data dignity, and people kind of find their way to some mix of them.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that Albert Wenger, the investor, talks about. Time is the new money. And it sounds like that was one of the things that you're describing, where you can define work and value creation through simply what we choose to do with our time.
Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, we're seeing glimmers of that future already. For instance, influencers are people who figured out how to get paid just for being human and living, right? And some kind of a more,
though I will say I get the sense they work very hard to stage those photos.
Yeah, I mean, I admit I had to kind of suppress some sort of gag reflex when I brought up that example, but one of the things about trying to think about economics and the future is that you have to be, how can I put this? You have to be very tolerant of the variations of how people think and feel. It can't be all about your own values. And so basically, if an influencer on Instagram or something can do well, I always celebrate people's success unless it's directly cruel, which it occasionally is. But what I'd rather do is try to find the parts of it that give us hope for the future. And what I can see there is that the influencers are serving as prototypes for what I hope will eventually be a better sort of organized or unionized movement where people share and hedge their risks and become somewhat responsible for each other in order to promote quality and all the other things I talked about. But essentially, yeah, influence in itself should be a paid thing. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be much broadly paid as there's more and more AI and automation and robotics in the future. Yes,
the world of abundance as opposed to the world of scarcity that we assume. So I just want to go back to some of your big reforms. Number one is you get rid of the algorithm that feeds us pieces of content for profit. That would be a very big deal. And then you make it so that we own our data, possibly through these intermediaries that quote unquote unionize on our behalf. And then we share in that value and profit. And then we change the business models of these massive social media companies and Google and the rest of them so that there's actually value changing hands, which ends up changing their incentives, their practices in ways that help us as opposed to hurt us. Did I get those three big reforms more or less right?
Yeah, pretty much. If I can just make some very slight adjustments. I don't believe in evil algorithms. My problem with the algorithm is that it's for the benefit of a third party who's paying. If you can use some of these behavior mod algorithms with full transparency for your own benefit, if you want to try to change your own behavior, I have no objection, obviously. So the real problem is that third party payment and benefit. Like the algorithm has to serve you; it can't serve somebody else.
That makes sense. So in other words, if I'm like, hey, I'm trying to quit smoking, or I'm trying to do something,
yeah,
like improve my consumption of Jaron's podcasts. Like I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake to go down a path of having algorithm police that try to ban certain algorithms. What I think it's absolutely reasonable to have police who ban illegitimate and hidden transactions that are manipulative. So, like, if somebody's paying your broker to benefit them instead of you, that should be illegal. On the other hand, the particular algorithm the broker uses should not be illegal. The illegal part should be the falsified allegiance.
Understood. So there's absolutely no problem with Netflix telling me what to watch next.
I in my own sense right now, Netflix is on the good side of the line. There's occasional things on Netflix that bug me, but I feel like they're just doing it out of osmosis from their neighbors in Silicon Valley. Occasionally, the Netflix algorithm seems to lead you to some of their more paranoid and low budget silly things. And I think that's not in their financial interest. It's just that it's the standard practice and people are just used to it. So when engineers move between companies, it just kind of travels with them without even anybody considering why.
So as long as no one's profiting unbeknownst to me from what the algorithm's feeding me, it's okay. So presumably Netflix isn't getting more money based upon my my choosing Tiger King over something else.
See, that's the thing is basically what Netflix wants you to do is keep paying. And that seems to me to be a reasonable business model. Like it's a transaction for value, and it might not be perfect, and there might be occasional silly things that happen, but overall it's okay. It's not destroying civilization. It seems like a reasonable, traditional, proven way to do things as a business. You pay for service and you stop paying if you don't want the service. It's very straightforward.
So an example of something that would not be okay would be if like I was served up something from a third-party advertiser, like as happens on YouTube routinely. Is that correct or no?
Yeah. So the YouTube algorithm, so this is a bit controversial. YouTube will say it isn't so. I've done my own experiments and it appears to be so, but I haven't done them in sufficient numbers to feel like I could publish results. But most people who look at this report that if the YouTube recommendation engines just recommends a sequence of videos to you, whether it knows you or not, it seems to, after some, usually like 17 hops, land you in some sort of weird, paranoid, dark territory. And
17 steps to hell.
But typically. What?
17 steps towards hell by YouTube.
So, yeah, that's right. That's right. So more steps than Dante had, but and so if YouTube was a paid service, I really think that effect would go away. Because their interest would stop being keeping you hooked, but just keeping you paying. And keeping you paying is a very different motivation than keeping you watching.
That's so deep. I love it so much. I think that's a great illustration that people understand of the different dynamics.
You know, one of the things that's interesting about money is it has a kind of course, it can corrupt people and bring out the worst, and the pursuit of money is the root of all evil and all that. And that can be so. But there are also times when it can kind of help clarify a situation. For instance, when in the last centuries, as people started to organize labor movements and started to work, instead of demanding the ability to earn absolutely as much money as possible by working as hard as possible, they negotiated free time, weekends and holidays and time with family as part of the benefit package, even though it probably costs some money. And that's a very interesting thing. Like once you can look at your choices as an adult with everything revealed and without any sneakiness, people actually tend to make better choices. And so I think what would happen is YouTube as a business would care less about this addictive quality and more about just getting paid. And then people using YouTube wouldn't expect to sit there like on a drip watching recommended videos, but instead would say, hey, I'm paying for this. I demand to see something good like you do on Netflix. And there'll be complaints if they don't. It just seems like a healthier arrangement on both sides. I think everybody would feel better.
I know you've been fighting for these changes for a while now. Like, how do you see that fight unfolding?
Yeah, it's a generational effort. I mean, the thing that I kick myself over again and again is I keep on wondering if back in the 80s or 90s, if I'd screamed a little louder or somehow been more skillful, if I could have helped steer this thing a little better. Because I was in a few crucial junctures where some things went wrong in my view. And I sometimes wonder if I was just a little too polite or something back then.
Don't put that pressure on yourself, man. These things are like freaking like, you know, like, I mean, like that.
You know, at this point we have this crazy situation where, the world has aligned itself around these, bummer information systems to a significant degree, not absolutely and totally, but you know, there's a lot of it. And people will often bring up to me, well, what about the old media like Fox News or whatever that has it? But the problem is that even that is being colored and guided by the bummer machine. What happens is memes or different tropes, plans of attack, talking points get born through the bummer machine, through this process of algorithmic amplification. And then they're turned into old-fashioned broadcast on Fox and other channels. So
it's true, Jaron. The first time I tweeted something and then it popped up on cable news, I was like, wow.
Yeah. So we have a job to do now, and it's not going to be easy. I mean, but things do change, and I one thing I noticed is that a lot of if you keep track of the number of former high executives or founders from Facebook who've publicly renounced what Facebook does, it's really become a long list. I mean, it's almost not news anymore.
Well, this is the tough thing about this, Jaron, is like when you see and hear that, like I appreciate it. I'm friends with some of those people. But what you sense is that like Facebook has become this historic money-making machine, and then enough people made enough money where they can step out and be like, fuck it, like now I can like, you know, throw rocks at you and I'm worth millions of dollars, so like nothing bad can happen to me at this point, like, you know, the stock like the stock vested. I mean, I'm grateful to those people, but that is like the sense you have, and I am glad. I mean, they could probably make more money if they still went along with it and kept their mouth shut.
I know some of them as well, and I find them to be sincere, you know, and I would actually, a funny thing to me is that a few of them, and I'm thinking of Sean in particular, but there's some others too, who have kind of backfilled their memories to say, well, actually, we were evil geniuses at the time, but now I renounce that evil plan that we hatched. But I was there. I knew some of them at the time they were doing it. I don't think they actually knew what they were doing. I
think, you know, I agree with you. It's not like they weren't like malevolent. You know, it's like they were like building this thing, and, you know, like you make a choice that seems perfectly fine at a certain size and scale, and then, you know, you can't foresee some of the effects over time.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's what happened. I think this thing is mostly a sort of a giant farce rather than an intentional conspiracy or anything.
Well, one thing we're going to be fighting alongside you on is trying to activate people's data rights. We're going to be announcing an initiative in that direction. Please consider me a friend and ally in your work, Jaron, because I think you have so much to offer. Your vision of the internet would make the world so much better. And it's a vision that we need to make happen because the alternative is disastrous.
Hey, so I have a question for you. Do you remember when earlier this year we were looking at each other for like a minute, but you weren't sure if you recognized me and you decided it wasn't me?
Was this at the Colbert show?
Yes, it was.
I looked at it, I was like that dude looks a lot like Jaron Lanier.
Yeah, I play in the band on the Colbert Show with John Batiste and Stay Human when I'm in New York, which obviously hasn't been lately because of, you know, the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, I was playing in the band, and I said to John, "Hey, I want to go say hi to that guy," and he was saying, "No, man, we got to." That's a tough band to be in. It's like he doesn't go easy on us. So I was being worked. So So,
well, I'm so glad that you raised that, because I was like, man, maybe I'm just like, I mean, like, you're a pretty distinctive looking guy. But I was like, maybe there are other people that look like
Nah, that's actually me. Yeah.
I shouldn't have put it past you, man. I mean, like, you as late night musician makes more sense than there is like a doppelganger of you walking around. So I could have put two and two together.
Well, look, man, thanks for being there. And I think your contribution in running was really profound, because it got the national conversation to be about our real future decisions, rather than about symbols and identity and kind of this endless churn of hopeless stuff. And well,
thank you.
And it really isn't that often. I mean, I don't want to be overly cynical about this, but it isn't often that a national politician brings a new idea into the stage and starts a conversation about something real that needs to be talked about. It's like, how often does that happen? I don't know. I mean, rare. It's rare.
Well, thank you. And one thing I think is awful is that it takes someone to run for president for us to talk about some of these issues. I mean, what the hell is that? Like, what kind of mechanism is that? It's really sad how behind the times our public discussion and our politicians are. Thank you so much, Jaron. You're like a true visionary, and we are going to fight for your vision of the internet for all of our sakes. Please do consider me a friend and ally in anything you do.
Okay, man. And I'm sure you have a remarkable future ahead, and I congratulate you and celebrate you, and I wish you the very warmest success.